Hello, everybody. Aeronautics. I love it. So, I'm bringing a perspective to the discussion here today from a parent's point of view. Aside from my past experiences, really it's more the experience of a parent who has no musical background, who's married to another person who's a parent with zero musical background. So needless to say, we did not dance at our wedding. But once we had kids, music wasn't the first thing on our mind. I have to say, although that's not true, Simone actually played music to the baby while he was inside. So that was my first indication that I was not in control of the situation. Never would have thought of that. But really what I'm going to talk about is the idea of what atypical means. The first thing you think of as atypical is what? What comes to mind when I say atypical? Normal, not normal. Atypical usually in the educational industry means a slow learner, a person who has some disability. It's usually an approach to a child that doesn't fit the standard curriculum that's in the school system. That kind of goes against the grain of not only how I was brought up, but how I think human beings develop in general. So as I said, my wife controlled from day one how we were going to bring up our child. She didn't know she was going to be part of this, so that's why she never comes to these things. Where it all started in our development with our children is from a whole school perspective. My wife decided once our child was born, she wanted to stay home with our son. From there, she discovered a program that was a homeschool program. The homeschool program that she discovered, and Sherry only gave me 10 minutes, so I'm going to move fast. So there's a large discussion here, but it really stemmed from brain-injured children. This program was geared towards brain development in brain-injured children. Very controversial because it started in the 50s. In the 50s, there was something called patterning. People who might be in the medical field might know what patterning was and why it wasn't effective. It was actually kind of a scam because you would have kids who had no mobility. They were told to pattern their children in a cross-pattern way, and that would facilitate stimulation that would help the brain develop. By itself, it doesn't work, but parents who are desperate, who have nowhere to go with a brain-injured child who's immobile, will do almost anything. So they were paying a lot of money for this system. Where this program was, and I'm going to go quickly from there to the other part of this discussion. So this institute, which is based in Philadelphia, didn't just take this patterning, it was only part of it. They took the idea of stimulation of the brain. And so brain stimulation became their core discovery factor. How do you stimulate the brain? If you have someone who doesn't hear, then you stimulate the hearing. That part of the brain can then become active and grow. Needless to say that after more than 50 years, they've helped deaf children hear, they've helped blind children see, they've helped palsy children, autistic children, across the spectrum of brain development. They have been very effective, but yet they still don't fit what's considered the standard of development in the medical field, mostly because of how they approach it. That's kind of their issue, and that's another long story. But to take that program, which was a brain-injured program, they realized haphazardly that as a parent was teaching a brain-injured child, they would have a well child who was much younger than the brain-injured child, and discovered that all of a sudden they had a 2-year-old that could read and do math, because the older brain-injured child was getting a program that was a math program and a reading program. So they discovered that it can also be effective for the well brain. Really what you can take away from that is that brain development is a standardized activity. whether the brain is damaged or not damaged, whether it has developmental issues or not, the brain develops the same way in both a healthy brain and in a development problem brain. That's because the brain functions in a system that's finite. And yet, whatever displacements you have in the brain, the development of the brain is the same. So now we've equaled the field, and that's what I wanted to get to at this point, that a brain-injured brain and a well brain develops in the same way with the same stimuli from the environment. That is kind of like a blanket statement. Now, if you take that idea, and now you take the idea of atypical, and that you say what is standardized, like testing, what is standardized, like curriculum in our system, becomes very, very finite in the way it can help a brain develop. And so if you have disabled children or if you have a well child, but everything is geared towards the well child, then you have a system of atypical learners. But really, learning is atypical. So how do I relate that to music? We had a comment that someone put down a bunch of instruments on the floor, and whatever drew your fancy, you went to go for that instrument, and that was the instrument of your love. Music facilitates individuality better than anything we can do out there. Whether you decide to become an accountant or an aeronautical engineer or a programmer, those things don't come until later on. But as children, babies, we tend to already have an instinct of who we are. And so music is already geared towards the individuality of each person. We're attracted to a type of music, to a type of way of playing, and then we develop our talents from that. So to say that music is just, we all know what music does for us intellectually, emotionally, but the understanding that the atypical learner or the learner itself has an instinct for music from the day one, from the time they're born. So in our homeschool program, we decided to teach our children many languages. My wife doesn't speak French, but she taught our children French. Doesn't speak Spanish, but taught our children French. Now, she's Asian, and you can only imagine French accent, Asian accent. I mean, our kids did not know what French sounded like until we played French DVDs with like Disney, you know? And they're like, that's what French is supposed to sound like. But that didn't matter because children can intuit what is right based on sound. So children have an intuition right from the beginning. Of course, I was the skeptic, but the point is we taught them 12 languages, 8 of which have stuck. 8 languages have stuck. Now, they don't think they can speak language, and they can't really because they haven't practiced all 8. But they can understand Italian, they understand Japanese, they understand Chinese. However, the one language that no one really understood, which was a language, was music. The musical language was like any other language that we taught them. Now, all of our friends, I've got 3 minutes, so all of our friends would say, you can't teach a child that young that many languages. They'll never be able to figure out all those languages. And I gave them a scenario. My scenario was that if you have a small baby facing up from a crib, and looking down at this baby were 5 faces, let's say 6 faces. And each of those faces in the family, grandma, grandpa, father, mother, all spoke different languages. That baby, by the age of 1, would be able to communicate with each one of its grandparent or parent in those languages. The child's brain has the ability, both brain injured or not, to learn at a very young age language. Music is a language. And from a very young age, it should not be thought of as something that comes later in life. It shouldn't be part of a curriculum. It should be part of our lives and a lifestyle. And that's the standardized system that I'm trying to bring awareness that needs to change. If you standardize education and music is standardized, then it becomes part of the budgeting problem and a budgeting issue. It really has to stem from the idea that it is not just an intuitive part of development, but it's an intuitive part of community. And it should start right from the beginning. And although we're only given 10 minutes to speak, and there are so many other things that we'll talk about, I think Sherry's analogy that right now we're just throwing a pebble in the water and creating ripples, that if I would create one ripple, it would be to understand that learning from a very young age, from a baby, and music being part of that language that we teach babies, creates the development across the spectrum of development in children that will lead to everything about their individuality, about community, about self-awareness, and also about civility in our society. It has to be right from the beginning, and that's where our society needs to create change. So if I were to challenge anyone, I mean, you can't really challenge the system out there, because the system is a pretty, thick-headed, dogma, but I think if we can, in our households and in our friends' households, develop an understanding that from a very young age we introduce music, then I think at that point we can call what's called a gentle revolution. We can really create change in our system. That's it.
I'm so glad to hear what he said, because since I couldn't remember, or when I even can't remember, I know that my mother, I thank God for her, she's the one that gave me music, because she used to sing, I found my, and one day I said, thrill. And she said, on Blueberry, and I said, hill. And then she sang, Jesus, and I said, loves me. This I know. Taught me everything I know. Karen Payton is coming.
I'm not going to talk very long because I think what I'm saying might build on what Mark was saying, but I think Sherry invited me here to talk just about my experience as a parent of a young musician who has had some differences in learning. And in addition, I'm also an educator. So I just want to say a little bit about the beginning of my background, because it comes together with my experiences in those realms. So when I think of myself, the circles that, my professional and personal circles, I think of myself as my parenting and my educator background and my religious background. I'm a Quaker, come together, and I can't separate any of those out in how I approach myself as a parent, as an educator. And so the core of that comes that I believe that there's that of spirit in everybody, no matter whether I agree with their personal beliefs or not. And that includes, as a teacher, that I believe that children come to me already full of their being, and it's just my job to learn from them and to impart in them the gifts that I can give to them to help fulfill that being. So that is important to what I'm going to say about my approach to education. So I have 2 children, and I know that my bio says I'm talking about special education. I'm not what I would call a special educator in my job. I teach at a typical elementary school. It's a progressive school, a small private progressive school, but it's quote unquote a typical school. But I believe that all of us learn differently. So whether you're in a typical school nowadays or a school that is not a typical school, everybody has different learning styles. So it's not really necessary, I think, for teachers to consider ourselves special educators or educators. We all have to be able to differentiate education wherever we're teaching. So, but my master's degree was in special education with infants, so I did start out specializing in infants and early childhood special education. And then I happened to have a premature infant myself, who was only a little bit premature and then healthy, but that was the first kind of circle where my professional and personal being came into place. And then at one point I decided to transition to what you would call typical education, and I took a hiatus from working with children, and I worked in adult religious education. And then my son was born, who was full term, but not born, had a challenging birth. So he was very critically ill at birth. So then that even ramped up my educator's experience, and I remember waking up from my emergency C-section and thinking of all the things I would need to do based on my background as a profession, well, we'll have to do this, and I'll have to stop working, and we'll have to do all this and that to accommodate him. And it ended up that he was not that ill in life. He did have some motor delays and some other things, but he presents as a quote-unquote typical child in many ways, so we were very blessed in that. However, I was a violinist. I was a young violinist, not a older professional violinist by any means, but I played violin from 3 to about 18, so that was very much my life. And so I took out my violin when my daughter was young, who was my oldest child, just because I could only imagine that you would learn music. And then she started piano when she was older as well. But it was my son who, when he was about 2.5, and when he was young, he had motor delays, just meaning that, his development in crawling and that kind of thing was delayed. Picked up somebody's mini guitar at a birthday party or something and was pretending to strum it. And from then we noticed that he just did all these things musically. He would drum on things, he would do all kinds of stuff. And this was a child who might not have been walking when they would expect him to walk or other things of that nature. And so he was the one who started begging me maybe by 3 or 4 to play the violin. And we have lots of friends, some other former students of Sherry's that we grew up with that were her students, that he heard that music. My daughter did not gravitate towards that. So though she did piano, and I thought it was very important for her, I had to let go that she was not going to want to do a lot of music, and I let go of that. But my son did. And what I found in his development, and this is where it mixes the part about being an educator and a parent, I believe when we talk about education, what some of the key problems in the world is that we talk about education as if we're preparing children for the next step in life. So we talk about kindergarten for elementary school, and the whole point of elementary school must be to get prepared for high school, and the whole point of that must be college. And the whole point of that is to get this X career. And I believe that education is preparing you to be a person. And that's everything you may do in your life. And that's not particular concepts and skills. We learn those concepts and skills in school to help us because we don't know what we'll be, as Mark was saying. So we learn those things. But my job as a teacher is not to prepare somebody to have a higher academic standard just for college. I'm teaching them how to be a mathematician for whatever is going to happen in their life, or to love books for whatever is going to happen in their life. And that includes college, but that's everything. And so that's the approach we took with my son and my children with music. And what we discovered was, for him, particularly with some of the motor delays, so for example, when he was young and young kids count first on your fingers for math, that was hard for him to isolate his fingers, and that's something that's a given. You assume that kids will do that. But he was playing that cello that he plays. Or it would be hard for him maybe to track reading when he was reading, but he has this amazing ear and he could do music, and he was playing pieces. And so he would have teachers and other people who would see him and would be shocked that he could do that. Later in his life, he ended up having epilepsy, which is very much under control, but it's something that I went and said to, and that's based on the injury probably from birth. I said to his neurologist at one point, so what would you recommend we do for optimal just brain health? He's very bright, he's very functioning in school. Like many kids, there's things that he needs accommodations for, but what would you do? And the first words out of his mouth were to play a musical instrument, which he's already been doing for 5 years, so that was great. But I think that's important that even somebody in science, this head of this pediatric neurology in a major hospital would say that would be the number one thing to keep your brain healthy. And the other important part, the last thing I wanted to say as educator is brain activity means learning. So when your brain is active, you're learning, and that could mean when you're frustrated, when you have to deal with persistence, when you're making mistakes, that's when you're learning. I had a colleague who went to a conference recently, a math conference, and they were talking about when you know everything quickly, your brain, they've had imaging, your brain is not active. So for somebody who is great at something, they can just do it quickly, that if they stop learning that particular piece that they're doing. So they need to have a little more of a challenge or to make mistakes or have a problem for their brain to start lighting up. And there's lots of research that we talked about, and you were mentioning too, in that learning to play a musical instrument lights up your brain. So I truly believe as a parent that my son's development was changed by his learning a musical instrument. I believe the synapses were different in his brain. There were things that he wouldn't have been able to do if he wasn't doing that. And it happens to be that he loves that, and that's his soul. And that might not be everybody, but if everybody is not given the opportunity for something besides what we call school, then we don't know what would happen for people. And even somebody like my daughter who did not end up wanting to continue with music, that was essential to her development that she did that. And I believe that we have this, from this morning we were talking about, we have this kind of social, economical, we were talking about problems that can come from, social, economical backgrounds. And one of the issues is that in different schools, and my children are at a private school and kids are at different schools, people have different experiences. And some of people's achievement, much of it is based on their experiences that they do, not based on where they are, not based on how smart they are, not based on their brain. So if you are constantly traveling or listening to all kinds of different kinds of music and doing different things, there's different brain activity, and then people who have other experiences have other brain activity, but they might not have the same as those other people. And then our education system is stacked so that what we call being educated or academic achievement is very much in the realm of things that have from certain backgrounds and from certain things that people do. So I think music is one of those things that would be available to everybody at every place, and that would be a true education. And I think that's very important to do. And I think if we think of education as teaching people to think, and as a musical curriculum as part of that, then we'd just be actually better off in society, and we wouldn't have so much differences across our educational system. Thank you.
There's a song that I know that just says ordinary people. And all that means to me at this moment is that it doesn't matter who you are. If you are giving to your children something special, they will receive something special. The last of our parent panel is Helena May. Welcome her, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to first and foremost thank Sherry Anderson for making this happen, for creating a community that most people would say, well, that could not be done, for creating this incredible group of young musicians, parents, inspiring the next generation. So thank you, Sherry, for having me here and having the opportunity to speak. I am a mother of 4, like Veronica, and I have humble beginnings. I just want to give you slightly background about myself so that as I talk about metrics, what does it mean, right? So it's one can say it's about standardized testing. Is it required? And what does it mean in terms of educating our children, our society, getting a learning organization and learning community going to build on what Karen and Mark have been saying. I'm unlike my 4 children who are 15, 13, 11, and 9, and two of whom were just in the viola orchestra as we were eating lunch. They have the privilege of learning music early on. And I grew up in a very small, remote village in the mountains of Burma, now it's called Myanmar, where even to this day, it's still very remote to get to. It would take 2 days to go 60 miles. And to this day, Okay, I'm good, thank you. Even to this day, there's no electricity, so I grew up without electricity all my lives. And then when we were getting ready to immigrate to the United States, we stopped over to the big city, then was called Rangoon, and now it's officially called Yangon, and learned that children actually got to learn piano. I'm like, what's that? Music. I mean, it's such a foreign concept. And growing up, I always felt that I was so rich. My mother, who is a teacher, she was a elementary school teacher, In that village, there isn't really an official standardized school per se. It was really parents getting together and creating a learning environment. And at that point, the government could sanction some topics are teachable and some are not. So certain languages are not teachable. And so my mother would sing. And she would sing what is now, as I got to know music, as my oldest started taking music piano lesson, effectively she was singing solfege, which is do, re, mi, fa, so, right? So she would hear music through radio that we had through running with battery. And so she just a little bit background about herself. She was born in China, and her family escaped Japanese occupation, and so they ran to Burma, just crossing the border. And so she herself was, by our standard, growing up in the mountains of Burma, very well educated. She actually had a formal education and had the concept of music and art. And so learned how to sing, and so she sang to us. And she would hear a piece of music, would then solfege, would sing it in do, re, mi, fa, so. So she would sing a tune after we moved to the United States, and it was actually Dvorak's New World Symphony. Of course, she didn't know that was Dvorak's New World Symphony. She just heard that. And so from her standpoint, she said, well, that's a piece of music from China. So that's... So music is really the common language for humanity, right? So my mother, who grew up in the midst of Japanese occupation in China, learned music, escaped to Burma in this remote village, was able to sing to us, and that was ingrained in our head. And when I said that I felt that I was quite rich growing up, we had clothes, we had food, we had shelter. And sometimes we would have medication, and my mother will see people who are sick, or her students who got sick, and she would then bathe them, clothe them, give them food, and heal them with love and with attention. And so how does one measure that? That is one individual contributing to a small village, a village of about 500 who are, very, very little means. But in that village, we were considered the rich family. And so when we emigrated to the United States, I really wanted to learn music. So I emigrated to the United States when I was about 14 years old. But at that time, economic means, we did not have the money to study music. I worked along with my mother in a sweatshop. After school, we would do piecework meal. And so in high school, when we were deciding on electives, the teacher, I had a choice to choose outside of the core classes what I could choose. And I really wanted to learn the violin. So I approached the music department, and they said, "Do you know how to read music?" I said, "No." And do you know, so have you ever played an instrument? I said, "No." So in that case, the orchestra teacher was kind enough to give me a violin and said that, suggest that I should really, sit down with the third grade orchestra and to start with them. Unfortunately, I did not have the support at the house in terms of, this is a very poor household growing up. We were all working. We were newly immigrants to the United States and New Jersey, and so all of us had to contribute. And so the idea of spending time to learn an instrument is such a luxury that it was not considered something that I should do. And so one of my goals, and Sherry is determined for me, is to learn the violin. So So with that said, what does it mean in terms of education and music? I overheard Veronica speaking earlier in the earlier panel about her learning music along with her children and then be able to identify them when they're making mistakes. And then to tie back to earlier panelist John Alston, who was quite an inspiration, who started a charter school in Chester. One of the things that he said that resonated with me, for those of you who are not in the room, is he is teaching young children in Chester community about different set of cultures, right? Their own teaching to their culture, what they're used to within Chester, and also the culture of classical music and trying to get understanding. So, he brought a very pragmatic view to education that ultimately, yes, we want to educate our children to get into colleges, to get a good job, but ultimately also tying to what Karen was saying is we want them to be life learners. So how do you teach children from the beginning to be life learners? We are in an environment in which our world is changing at the speed of digital speed, right? So the internet, it's out there, and it's a tremendous resources out there. So it's really educating our children to learn how to think, how to question, how to challenge the status quo. Mark said earlier that we can't really challenge the system. I beg to differ from that standpoint. Unlike John Alston, John and I had something in common. Both of us started charter schools. I tried to start a charter school along with a group of very well-intentioned parents, but we got stopped by local politics. And so that's challenging the status quo. We're not to say that the system is not working, but there's always room for improvement, right? For me to say the system is not working, I think would be, it's coming from the humble beginnings of no electricity to having ability to go to a system school where you're bused to if there's, if you live too far, and you have a teacher, whether or not he or she cares to educate, or the fact that there is a system and to educate. But then how do we measure whether or not we are doing well in this system? And how do we challenge the status quo from that standpoint? Because there's always room for improvement. That is the key, right? That ties right back to our life learners. We as human beings are life learners. And part of life learning is really to understand the connections that we have with each other, and how do we measure that? How do we measure the connection that my mother, who sang solfege without knowing that that's what she was doing, and who sang Dvorak without knowing that that was Dvorak, into influencing a group of us, myself and my 4 brothers, to be lifelong learners, to really challenge ourselves despite what we didn't have, right? So it's really, how do we measure the pace at which we learn? So I had to learn English along with learning the systems of, growing up in New Jersey at the age of 14 and working. So how do we ensure that, how do we measure that? So if we were to measure the status quo of having the person who did not graduate from college but is successful in starting a business, running a business, having a community, that is a measurement in itself, right? So one can say that the sphere of influence that we are having along the contribution to society. So the most basic fundamental metrics that everybody measures globally is GDP, gross domestic product. What are we producing? And so if we can measure just the GDP of those around us that's influencing based on the connections that we're making. So one example that I'd like to provide is that Mark, who's speaking very humbly here. He is a local businessman. He employs. He has employees, and he then contributes to society. And those employees are then also contributing to society. And he's teaching his children with music and education, and how do we then measure that. So if we can really, in measuring the lifelong contribution of education and long-term learners, that's what we really need to be looking at. And right now in New Jersey, we have the controversy of park. So for those of us who live in New Jersey, it's part of the Common Core curriculum. And there is a lot of controversy about park. And, there are two camps, right? Do we need park? Is it taking away from our children's education, learning rather than learning to the test? I think we need assessment, right? So actually, before we talk about assessments and testing and what have you, fundamentally, education today it's an industry. It's a huge industry. And, you have all sorts of various tests. You have your college prep tests, SATs, you have your GREs, what have you, all these tests. And then you also have your state standardized tests. So for those parents and families who prioritize the children to say, I want my children to be able to go to college so that he or she can get out of college and get a good college education. So let me put in the means into getting them SAT prep, ACT prep, private tuition. That is a measurement of not the achievement, but measurement of whether or not the parents have the means to do that. And so that is an incomplete measurement. And so when we have a standardized test that the state is and the federal government is providing Common Core, everybody is being measured to that, right? And so you don't need to pay a private tutor to say, how does my child going to perform in park? Or NJ Ask before that. So part of what I want to leave with this is that, is park really a bad thing? When it's really measuring, so let's take it two coins, right? So like everything else, there's two sides of the coin to everything. So if we look at our assessments as a way of test, as an assessment to see where is Johnny in learning his language, his science, his math. And then we use it based on Johnny's assessment, then how do I then use his level then to teach to his level, to understand where he is at, and to tie back to John Alston's earlier point about culture, to understand Johnny's background, understand what is his learning style, and whether or not he needs to be taught differently versus he needs to be taught within the norms, if you will, right? So without assessment, we won't know where Johnny is. And so if we were to use assessment as purely as a carrot, not as a stick, then assessments are good. Then we can say that, Johnny is progressing well. He is learning. We're teaching him how to think, how to question, how to analyze. And so that is the lifetime learning. But if we were to use that assessment as a stick to say, Johnny, you're failing, and you are not going to measure up, then we are failing in using the metric. And lastly, and most importantly, is how does one measure the respect and attention that Johnny's community is getting. So whether Johnny's mother, father, care provider, grandmother, grandfather, aunts, uncles who's supporting Johnny in this process. And the moment that we provide Johnny's caregivers and guardians the respect that he or she deserves from the get-go, and educating the support network, educating the support to say, here's the importance of why Johnny's learning language, learning math, learning music, learning history is important. Then once you provide that to the support network, then it becomes a community, right? Then this is where the connection is coming from. When my oldest one started piano lesson, I didn't know how to read music, and so I was learning along with her. And her first challenge in reading music and playing piano was in the London Bridge. There's a, London Bridge. It's that particular, one measure at a time. And it took her a long time to learn 2 measures. A long time. It took her, it seems like months. And so one can say that, well, she could have, she is dumb. She could learn things differently. Or you can say, praising the process, that look at you mastered this. It was hard. And it was hard for you, but you did it. So to this day, I still use that example that she started when she was 5.5, learning the London Bridge, the first 2 measures, putting the 2 measures together. And said, remember how hard that was? And when you finally did it, how did it feel? How did it feel for you? So it's really praising that process. And that's a metric to say, you did it. It didn't matter how long it took you to do this. Yes, your sister took 5 minutes, and yet it took you 2 months. But that's okay, because you learn differently. You're different human beings. And to be able to, and now using that as a carrot to say that, that was hard work, but you did it. And so now I can use it to anything that she's learning right now to say, again, using music education as the background, right? When you break down into learning music, what is it? It's about learning the rules, how to read the language, how do you communicate? So music, let me take a step back. There's, coming from someone who doesn't know music at all, but I am an analyst by profession. And so when you analyzed, so as a profession, when we measure, as an engineer, what is the problem? And then you break it into different components. And so it's really taking when you look at music, it's 2 parts. One part is art, and the other part is science. And they're both equally important. And so the science part is, what is the time flow? What's the, how do you measure things? And then once you know the rules, then it's putting the hard work of practice, to Veronica's point earlier, and then now putting together and seeing the reward, right? So that's the process. And imagine music learning and that process can be applied to anything that our kids are going to tackle. And the art part, nothing can duplicate that. What Mozart wrote is played very differently by whether it's by Devon or whether it's by Alexa. And so it's the different interpretation of it, and then putting it all together. So I wish that I was able to speak to the younger kids a little bit, because in the future in our society, as technology advances, there's going to be a lot more of machine versus man. And in machine versus man age, or humanity, it's all about collaboration, and nothing gives us better education than how to collaborate in music. and to put that orchestra together, to learn to work with each other, to understand each and other's strengths and weaknesses, and how to put it together to be able to put beautiful music together. So thank you.